We're here with Tony Mataya, partner at Think Solutions, and someone who's emerged as a real thought leader in the nearshoring space as an advisor. And Tony, again, thank you for joining us today at our event. Our event, by the way, was Mexico's Silicon Valley, getting the real story. And a lot of what we talked about today at our event was, and you brought it up yourself, Tony, is the work performed out of nearshore versus offshore. And I was curious to hear a little bit more about your sense of the quality of work performed out of nearshore and how that helps outsourcing clients.
Yes, I think the key thing really is looking at what services you're trying to get, making sure there's a good match. But what we found is there's a high level of skill available in the nearshore environment. And so what we've seen is not only do you get the advantages of the lower cost resources, but you can also leverage the higher skill, wrapping in collaborative development, social media, creative design, and those things that today's applications are requiring.
So one of the things you also talked about is inflation, and inflation having some real negative impact on sourcing into India. Are you concerned about any of that filtering into Latin America or even markets like Brazil?
Yeah, for example, Brazil, if you look at nearshoring in Latin America, there's big differences between the different inflation rates. One of the advantages that Mexico has over Brazil, for example, is that they have a much lower inflation rate that tracks closer to the U.S. And the Brazilian marketplace, their demand is so high internally that they end up having a higher inflation rate, and they have less work exported just because they're doing so much internally. But in the case of Mexico, that inflation rate is tracked closer to the U.S., where inflation in India has grown so much just because of their overall growth. Their prices are growing to where now that's eating into the competitive gap they had over the nearshoring alternatives.
Interesting. So what is your outlook for nearshoring in general? Do you think we're in the early days here?
I think so. I really think it's booming. One of the differences, as I mentioned before, the close proximity in the same time zones, as well as the ability to have collaborative work. It's easier to manage projects, for example. And I think that makes a big difference in today's development environment in the IT space. In the manufacturing space, again, we're doing a lot of collaborative design and those kind of things where you need designers working more in the front end, manufacturing expertise working in the design end to do more efficient work there. It's becoming a lot more prevalent.
Interesting. And then one final thought, and you brought it up during your presentation, something that a lot of debate about, a lot of discussion is the personal safety issue in Mexico. And you shared some interesting statistics. If maybe you could talk a little bit about that when you did your global analysis of crime rates.
Right. When we looked at the crime rates, we found that it's very much a localized phenomenon. So, for example, there are some states, we compared the states of Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and the U.S., and there are some states that Mexico tracks a lot closer to the U.S. In fact, in Jalisco, which is what we were talking about in some of the sessions today, where they have a high concentration of high technology, that state compares favorably or similarly to Texas, for example, where I'm from. So I found that to be really interesting. And then you go at the other end of the spectrum, in certain pockets you have higher homicide rates, for example, in Mexico than in the U.S., but still much lower than Brazil and still much lower than Colombia. So if you ask people their perception, they would say, well, Mexico's very violent, but compared to Brazil, in a lot of cases that's not the case when we looked at state-by-state comparisons. And I heard a statistic earlier that 97%, when you take a 97% number, 3% of the municipalities have a lot of the violence. So we haven't seen that in our research yet, but we're going to look at that. So we stayed more at the state level. But it's interesting how one city, Washington, D.C., for example, can influence the rating of an entire state. And I think you'll see the same thing in Mexico, where the border states are a lot more dangerous than, say, most of the areas of Mexico, which are very, very safe to work in.
That's right. That's right. Well, great point. Well, Tony, we really appreciate you joining us today, and hope to see you again soon.
Okay. Thank you very much.